Hi everybody, we're going to continue to look at the names of God. This is the Indonesian message about the name Jehovah Jireh, or God will provide, or Yahweh Yireh, depending upon how you pronounce it and what you're used to hearing. But the interesting thing about names is the better that we know somebody, we tend to have more names for them. Like when I first met Patty, her name was Patty. And as time went on and we got married, she had other names that I would call her, honey or sweetie, right? Even your friends, when you first meet somebody, you might not even remember their name. I'm not the best at names. So when I work with younger people, it's actually helpful because I could call them dude or buddy or something like that until I remember their names. And then when you do know their names, you'll call them by their names, but the closer you get to them, you might actually have nicknames for them. I mean, growing up, some of my friends had multiple nicknames for me, especially based on my last name. So the better that you know somebody, oftentimes the more names you have for them. And some of those names might even become nicknames through experiences that you've shared together. So in the same way in the Old Testament especially, we are shown so many of these names of God because God's desire is that we know him better. All of these names are designed to help us understand his character better, his heart better, and be able to experience him in those ways better. So the name that we'll look at today is the name, what we typically say in English, of Jehovah Jireh, which means God is the one who provides. Now, what's interesting is sometimes when we pray, or at least when I pray, we're often asking God for things. We're asking God to provide things. And that ends up being the bulk or the core of our prayer. But in Matthew chapter 6, verse 8, I wanted to read this for you. It says this, "And when you pray, don't keep babbling like people who don't know God, because they think that they'll be heard because of their many words. Don't be like them, because your Father knows what you need before you ask him." So if God already knows what we need before we ask, why even ask? So what would the purpose of prayer really be if it's not all about asking God for things? And really, prayer is about a relationship with God, and it's about talking to him, and it's about listening to him so that we could understand his heart more, because he actually already knows what we need. And when we see this name in the Old Testament is one moment in Genesis 22. It's in a moment when a father desperately needs God to provide something to save his son. Now think with me about what things you need God to provide for you right now, especially depending upon your situation with the coronavirus going on. Maybe your stocks and your retirement have been crushed by the financial situation. And maybe finances is something that you need. And maybe you've lost things, jobs, and your income is suddenly gone. Maybe you have lost relationships because you're feeling isolated. Maybe it's harder to get health care. Maybe it's hard to get toilet paper. Maybe there's things that you just need God to provide. As Westerners, as Americans, sometimes we think toilet paper is so important, but other cultures, I know they're looking at us and they're saying, what is the big deal about toilet paper? I mean, we understand water, we understand certain medicines, we understand certain basic foods, but why are Americans rushing out so much and getting toilet paper? And I understand, I'm with you, I'm American, I would get it if I hadn't lived overseas or maybe done a lot of camping. I was even with some friends from another country and they were laughing and joking about this, and they said, yeah, we get it, but don't you know you can use leaves? Don't you know you can use water? You just jump in the shower if it's that bad. And so the things that we think we need, sometimes we do desperately need. Sometimes we don't need as bad as we think. But what we know for sure is that God knows what we need. And he will provide what we need in the right way at the right time. Now, me being a father, if I was in a moment where I was going to lose my son or lose my daughter, two of the most precious people and most precious things in my life, I would want anything that would help me save them. I would want anything that would allow me to protect them. That if I could step in their place to save them or protect them, I would in a heartbeat. But if I couldn't, the thing that would be my heart, my longing for God to do and to come would be to say, God, will you provide? Will you provide a way out? Would you provide a different situation? Would you provide something to change so that I could protect my son or I could protect my daughter? And as we look at this name of Jehovah Jireh, it means God who will provide. And the reasons why we have these names is to understand more of God's character and understand more of God's heart, so that in everything that we face, we can see who God is and how we're designed to experience him. This name Jehovah Jireh is not in a past tense that God did provide, but is in the future tense and present tense of God will provide, so that God will continue to provide based on his love for his children, based on his plan for our future, based on being a God of hope and a God of restoration. So I'm going to read out of Genesis chapter 22, where we see this name used of Jehovah Jireh. I'll be reading out of verse 1 and 2, verse 7 and 8, and verse 14, and just filling in some of the story in between in my own words. Verse 1 and 2 says this: Sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham. And Abraham replied, Here I am, God. And then God said, Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Now, how would you react as a father, knowing that God is a loving God and calls you to do something like this? And I would wrestle with that. But it seems like Abraham responded to that because he believed so much in God's goodness. He believed so much in the other attributes of God, and he believed that God was all powerful. God created everything. So even if he had to do this, probably, most likely, God would even raise him from the dead, because he knew this was the son of promise. He knew that God had a plan for Isaac's life, so it wasn't time for Isaac's life to be over. So Abraham obeyed, and he went. And in this moment, whatever was going to happen, Abraham knew he needed God to provide in some way for Isaac's life to either come back or to continue on. So they went off with helpers to help them bring things. But when they got to the base of the mountain, Abraham told the servants to stay there, and he and his son took what they needed and they went up the mountain. And verse 7 and verse 8 say this: Isaac said to his father, The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered him, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. And the two of them went on together. And so as they went on, if you know the story, they went up to the mountain, they made an altar, they got the altar ready, Isaac laid on the altar, Abraham is ready to sacrifice his one and only son, the son of promise, and God says, stop. And he looks over, he's told to look over, and there's a ram in the thicket stuck in the bushes, and this ram becomes the offering. This ram becomes the burnt offering and takes the place of Isaac on the altar. Right? So this ram actually is someone who steps in, or something who steps in to save Isaac's life. And as that happens and they do the sacrifice, later in verse 14, it says this: So Abraham called the place, the Lord will provide, Jehovah Jireh. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. A question that we really need to wrestle with is, what do we need God to provide? And why do we need him to provide that? Because he actually already knows what we need before we ask. And so possibly what we need most is to trust him that he will provide exactly what we need, exactly in the right way, exactly at the right time. And the way that we will have the faith and the trust to wait until that time, to have the right perspective until that time, is by following him and deepening our relationship with him. You know, one of our good friends who just went back to Indonesia's name is Michelle. Michelle was here studying in grad school. She had planned to be here till July. She was taking her final classes. She was going to do the commencement ceremony at her college. She was going to celebrate 4th of July for the first time in America, and then she was going to go back to Indonesia. But when all of the COVID-19 started breaking out and countries started to close their border and planes started to cancel a lot of flights, she and her parents decided it was probably best for her to come back to Indonesia earlier than planned. So she found a ticket, decided to go pretty quickly, purchased the ticket. She was emailed the ticket. She printed the ticket. We dropped her off at LAX. And we said, call us if anything happens. And we were a little more than halfway home. And we got a call that Michelle's flight had been canceled. That airline didn't have any other flights going to Indonesia. So what Michelle began to do at LAX is go from terminal to terminal to terminal, looking for airlines that were open, looking for airlines that were international, and going from counter to counter saying, do you have anything tonight or tomorrow to go to Jakarta? And she went from one place to another, to another, to another, and nothing. Either they didn't have any flights to Jakarta, or the flights that they had been canceled as well. And here was Michelle believing that she was supposed to go that night. Even as we talked, she said, don't come back and get me yet. I feel like I'm supposed to go tonight. The thing that she would need is a flight. She would need a plane ticket because her ticket was canceled. The only way she's getting to Indonesia is with a plane ticket. And we said, okay, to just let us know what's going to happen. So the thing she needed in that moment was clear. She needed a plane ticket. And she needed to trust God that he hadn't forgotten about her, that he was still seeing her, that he was still with her, and he still had a plan for her, even in the midst of this turmoil, even in the midst of a canceled plane ticket, even in the midst of going back to Indonesia months earlier than she wanted to or planned to. God still had a plan. And she told us that as she went back to the international terminal, she saw a line, just a big line. And she asked, what's this line for? And somebody said it's for a flight that's going to Japan. It's transiting in Japan. She said, well, after Japan, where is it going to? And they said it's going to Jakarta, Indonesia. And she hopped in that line and waited in line and waited until her turn came. And she went up to the counter and said, my other planes have been canceled. Do you have one seat to go to Jakarta tonight? And they said, yes, we do. And she got the plane ticket and she took off, and she has already landed safely in Indonesia, back at home with her family. God will provide. And those types of things become almost monuments or memorials in our lives to allow us to remember in the times that we don't know how God will provide, we don't know when God will provide, that God will provide because he has always provided. Think of Isaac's life, think of Abraham's life after that moment of God providing. You could look back and remember that there is no way God will not provide because up until now, he has always provided. This is who Jehovah Jireh is. And one of the amazing things about this story is up on a mountain in the region of Moriah, somebody was going to be sacrificed. And in the last moment, a ram took his place and saved his life. The place where Jesus was crucified was also a mountain in the region of Moriah. What people often call Calvary, the place where Jesus died upon a cross to take our place, to allow us to have the forgiveness of sins, also was on a mountain in a region of Moriah. That what happened in Genesis 22, where we learn part of God's heart and his character to be Jehovah Jireh, God who will provide, we see lived out in the life of Jesus, of God who will provide exactly what we need in exactly the right way at exactly the right time. God will continue to provide. He has not left us, and he will continue to lead us. One of his best provisions and ultimate provision he's given us is the life of Jesus. And if you have not trusted Jesus as your Savior, I encourage you to just say, Jesus, I want you and I need you now. And all of the other things that you need, whether it be a plane ticket, whether it be to pay rent, whether it be to figure out how to do e-learning homeschool with your kids or you yourself, God will provide, because he is still Jehovah Jireh. Be safe. God bless.